Ireland was a land soaked in blood, a land where rebellion is crushed, where hope is starved, and where the chains of empire tighten with every passing generation. The British called it a colony, the Irish called it a prison. For hundreds of years, the Irish fought back. They fought with swords, with pikes, with muskets, with fire. But the story was always the same: uprising, resistance, slaughter. The rebellion of 1798, crushed. The 1803 rising, snuffed out. The young Irelanders in 1848, broken before they could even lift a rifle. Every defeat came with executions, mass graves, and another generation forced to bow to the crown. Then came the famine. It was not a famine of nature. The fields still grew food. The British still exported grain from Irish soil. But the Irish starved. 1 million dead. 1 million more fled across the Atlantic. They arrived in America weak from hunger, but burning with rage. The signs on shop doors read, "No Irish need apply." In the streets of New York and Boston, they were beaten, mocked, hated. The British had stolen their land. Now Americans sneered at them like dogs, but the Irish did what they had always done. They fought. They clawed their way into American life. And when war broke out between North and South, the Irish fought on both sides. They marched at Antietam, they bled at Gettysburg, they learned how to kill, how to command, how to wage war, and when the war was over, they turned their eyes to the enemy that had haunted their people for centuries: Britain. But how does an exiled people fight an empire? How do starving labourers in New York and Chicago take on the might of the British crown? The answer was madness, or genius. They would invade Canada. They would take British land, force Britain to negotiate, and trade Canada for Ireland's freedom. And so, an army was raised, an army of exiles, of forgotten men, of Irishmen who had lost everything. They crossed the border, rifles in hand, hearts full of vengeance, ready to strike the first blow for Irish freedom. They would win battles, they would spill blood, and they would lose everything. This is the story of Ireland's forgotten war, the Irish invasion of Canada. The Fenian Brotherhood were the architects of the war. To the British, they were nothing more than drunkards, criminals, and vagabonds. Irishmen too stubborn to know their place. To the Americans, they were an inconvenience, an embarrassment, radicals who didn't know their place. But to themselves, they were soldiers. They were the Fenian Brotherhood, a name whispered in the back rooms of saloons, passed between exiled Irishmen in dimly lit halls, spoken in defiance of an empire that had ruled their homeland with an iron fist for centuries. Fenians were not diplomats. They did not write letters begging for freedom. They did not wait for mercy from a crown that had never shown it. They were men of action. And they had one belief: Ireland could only be free through war. They had seen it before. America had won its independence through bloodshed. So had France, the Hungarians, the Poles, the Italians. Every nation that had been ruled by tyrants had risen, taken up arms, and spilled the blood of their oppressors. Why should Ireland be any different? The leader of this movement was John O'Mahony, a man who had been chased from Ireland after the failed Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. He had seen what British rule meant: starving children, mass graves, gallows filled with Irish patriots. From exile in America, he built the Fenian Brotherhood from nothing. His vision was clear. If an Irish army could not rise in Ireland, then it would rise on foreign soil. With him stood James Stephens, a man who had spent years in hiding, moving through Ireland in secret, gathering support for the coming war. Thomas Sweeney, an Irish-born US Army general, boasted that he could seize Canada with 5,000 men and march straight to Ireland next. When asked about his loyalty to America, he spat, "I am an American officer, it is true, but I am an Irishman first." And then there was John Boyle O'Reilly, the poet, the revolutionary, the escapee. He had been sentenced to die in a British prison in Australia, but he escaped, carrying with him the fire of rebellion. "The Irishman is willing to fight for freedom anywhere in the world, except in Ireland," he wrote. That was about to change. Their plan was reckless. Their numbers were small, but they had something greater than an army. They had rage. The target? Canada? Britain's prized North American colony, lightly defended, stretched across thousands of miles. If the Fenians could strike quickly, seize key cities, they could hold British land hostage and force London to bargain for Ireland's freedom. It was audacious, it was insane, and for the first time in over 100 years, Britain would have to fear the Irish coming for them. The Fenian Brotherhood was ready, the rifles had been bought, the men had been gathered, and the plan was set. For years, they had dreamed of striking back at the British Empire. Now, for the first time, they had an army to do it. The first move would be small, a test, a warning shot. On April 14, 1866, a group of Fenians set sail for Campobello Island, a small strip of land off the coast of New Brunswick, Canada. It wasn't a major military target, but it was British soil, and taking it would send a message to London that the Irish had come. Among them was John O'Mahony, the mastermind behind the entire Fenian movement. If this raid succeeded, it would be proof that their plan could work. But O'Mahony had made a fatal mistake. The British knew they were coming. As the Fenians stepped onto Canadian soil, their boots barely leaving a mark in the wet sand, the Royal Navy was already moving in. The Fenian invasion lasted barely a day. A few shots were fired, but the British forces crushed the raid before it even began. Outgunned and outnumbered, O'Mahony and his men scrambled back to their boats, retreating across the water as British warships loomed in the distance. The first blow for Ireland had been struck, and it had failed. It was an embarrassment. O'Mahony, once the most respected voice of the movement, was discredited. Many of his own men saw him as a fool. Some believed the invasion was doomed from the start. Others whispered that he had sabotaged it himself to avoid a real fight. But for every man who lost faith in the dream, there were 10 more ready to march. The failure at Campobello wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And now the Fenians would go bigger. They had seen their mistake. Campobello was too small, too isolated. If they wanted to strike fear into Britain, they needed a real victory. They needed a real battle. They needed Ridgeway. The first attempt had been a disaster. The British had crushed the Fenian raid at Campobello before it could even begin, but the Fenians weren't finished, not by a long shot. Failure wasn't new to the Irish. They had failed before. They had been beaten, starved, exiled, and yet they always came back. Now they had a new plan. They would strike not at some forgotten island, but at the heart of Canada itself. They would march into British territory, seize a town, and plant the Irish flag on enemy soil. The man chosen to lead the attack? John O'Neill. He was not a politician. He was not a dreamer writing poems about lost battles. He was a soldier. A veteran of the American Civil War, he had led cavalry charges for the Union Army. He had seen men killed in close combat, had heard the screams of the dying, had felt the heat of gunfire against his skin. Unlike some of the other Fenian leaders, O'Neill had no illusions. This was not about symbolism. This was war. And so on June 1st, 1866, under his command, an army of over 1,000 Fenian soldiers crossed the Niagara River from Buffalo, New York, into Canada. They carried Springfield rifles, the same guns used by Union troops in the Civil War. Many wore bits and pieces of their old military uniforms, the faded blue of the Union Army mixed with the ragged green of the Fenian Brotherhood. As they marched toward the town of Ridgeway, Ontario, they knew one thing for certain. They were the first Irish army in over 100 years to march against the British. For the first time since the days of Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet, the Irish were not fighting in defence, they were invading. They reached the town of Fort Erie with no resistance. The Canadian militia had not arrived yet. The Fenians looted supplies, cut telegraph lines, and prepared for the battle they knew was coming. And it did. The British were slow to react. They had assumed that the Fenians, like before, would be crushed before they could do any real damage. They were wrong. The Canadian government scrambled to assemble a force to stop the invaders. Most of their professional soldiers were stationed elsewhere, so they had to rely on the local militia, volunteers, shopkeepers, farmers and college students who had little to no combat experience. The unit that would face the Fenians was made up largely of young men from Toronto University. They were called the Queen's Own Rifles, and they were about to be thrown into the most terrifying experience of their lives. On June 2nd, 1866, the two armies met just outside the town of Ridgeway. The Canadians outnumbered the Fenians slightly, but they were inexperienced, poorly trained, and had never fought in an actual battle before. The Fenians, on the other hand, were battle-hardened veterans of the American Civil War. They had faced artillery barrages at Gettysburg, marched through the burning streets of Atlanta, and seen men blown apart by cannon fire. They knew how to fight. The Canadians did not. When the first shots rang out, the Queen's Own Rifles held their ground. They fired in volleys, standing in formation as they had been trained. But the Fenians did not fight in lines like European armies. They fought like Civil War skirmishers, spreading out, using trees, fences and hills for cover. They didn't just shoot, they killed. As the Canadians advanced, the Fenians let them come. And then, in perfect synchronization, O'Neill's men swept forward and counterattacked. The militia, confused and panicked, fell into complete chaos. Some soldiers shouted cavalry, believing a Fenian horse charge was coming. There was no cavalry. But the fear alone sent them running for their lives. In less than 2 hours, the Irish had completely broken the Canadian militia. The road to Toronto, to Hamilton, to the very heart of British Canada was open. An Irish army had just defeated the British. For the first time in history, the Irish flag flew victorious in battle against the Crown. But victory would not last. John O'Neill's men had won. But victory meant nothing without reinforcements. The plan had always relied on more Fenian forces arriving to support the invasion, but they never came. Why? Because in Washington, the US government was cracking down. At first, America had looked the other way, allowing the Fenians to operate freely. Many US politicians secretly supported them, seeing Britain as an old enemy from the War of 1812. But the moment the Fenians actually won a battle, Britain demanded action, and America folded. President Andrew Johnson, pressured by British diplomats, ordered US forces to arrest any Fenians trying to cross into Canada. O'Neill's army was now alone. The British reinforcements were coming, and they would come in force. With no supplies, no support, and no hope of holding out against the British army, O'Neill had no choice. The Fenians abandoned Ridgeway. They marched back across the Niagara River, where they were immediately arrested by US troops. The dream of an Irish foothold in Canada had died. And yet, the Fenians had done something no Irish army had done in centuries. They had fought the British, and they had won. But their fight was not over, because 4 years later they would try again, and this time John O'Neill would not retreat. The Battle of Ridgeway had proven something terrifying to the British and the Canadians. The Irish were not weak. The Fenian army, despite being outnumbered and unsupported, had crushed the Queen's Own Rifles and sent Canada's defenders into retreat. But the victory meant nothing. No reinforcements came. The US betrayed them. And John O'Neill, the man who had led them to triumph, was arrested the moment he set foot back on American soil. It was over, or at least it should have been. But the Fenians did not stop. For the next 4 years, the Brotherhood refused to accept defeat. O'Neill, freed from custody after only a few months, was not done fighting. He still believed that Canada was the key, that if they could strike a decisive blow, Britain would be forced to free Ireland. He gathered men, raised funds, and planned another invasion, and in 1870 they tried again. By now, Canada was ready. The Battle of Ridgeway had shocked the country into action. The government had expanded the militia, improved training, and built up defences along the US border. Still, O'Neill believed they could break through. On May 25, 1870, a Fenian force of over 600 men crossed into Quebec, targeting Eccles Hill. But this time there would be no Irish victory. The Canadian defenders, many of whom were Irish loyalists who opposed the Fenians, had set up an ambush. O'Neill and his men walked straight into a slaughter. The Canadians, hiding behind trees and rocks, opened fire on the Fenians as they crossed open ground. Within minutes, the Irish attack fell apart. O'Neill tried to rally his men, but it was hopeless. They were exposed, outgunned and being cut down from all sides. The Irish fled back across the border. O'Neill, humiliated, was arrested again by US authorities. This time there would be no escape, no second chance. He was court-martialed and stripped of command. The Fenian Brotherhood was falling apart, but one last raid would come. Even after 2 failed invasions, there were still some Fenians who refused to give up. In 1871, a final group of Fenian fighters launched a desperate raid on Manitoba, aiming for the Red River settlement. This time, there was no battle. The Canadian militia, now battle-hardened and well-equipped, crushed the Fenians before they even had a chance to fight. It was over. In the early days, the United States had secretly tolerated the Fenians, happy to see them strike at Britain. But by 1871, the government wanted them gone. Britain and America were negotiating a treaty, and Washington wanted to prove they were not harbouring terrorists. So, US authorities cracked down. The Fenian Brotherhood was declared a criminal organisation. Their funds were seized, their leaders were jailed. And just like that, the dream of an Irish invasion of Canada was dead. The Fenian Raids were a military failure. The British still ruled Ireland, Canada was stronger than before, and yet the Fenians changed history. Before the raids, Canada was a loose collection of British-controlled provinces. But after Ridgeway, Canadian leaders panicked. They realised that as long as they were divided, they would always be vulnerable to invasion. So in 1867, just a year after Ridgeway, Canada officially became a nation. The Fenians, without meaning to, had helped create the country they were trying to destroy. Though the raids failed, the idea behind them did not die. Many of the Fenians who fought in Canada went on to become leaders in the Irish War of Independence decades later. Figures like Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosser and John Boyle O'Reilly kept the fire of rebellion alive, ensuring that Ireland would one day rise again. In 1916, when the Easter Rising erupted in Dublin, the rebels carried Fenian flags and sang Fenian songs. The Fenian dream did not die in Canada, it just moved back to Ireland. British historians remember the Fenian Raids as a failure, a reckless, doomed adventure by men who had no chance of winning. But to the Irish, to those who had seen their people starve, who had watched their families die in the coffin ships, who had lived with the boot of the British on their necks for centuries, the Fenians were not failures. They were proof that even in exile, the Irish spirit could not be broken. They did not wait for freedom. They did not beg for it. They marched into enemy territory and took it with their own hands. And though they lost, they lit a fire that would burn until Ireland was free. In 1922, when the Irish War of Independence was finally won, the ghosts of the Fenians marched alongside the rebels. The British Empire had called them madmen. History had called them fools. But in the end, the Fenians had been right about one thing: Ireland would never stop fighting, and one day it would win.